This is KM Wyland, and you are listening to the 286th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I have reached the quarter mark, otherwise known as the end of the first act, in my historical superhero work in progress, Wayfarer. That means it's time for the 25,000 word edit, although I got windy and it has actually turned out to be more like the 30,000 word edit. This is a practice I've used on pretty much all of my books. Every quarter of the book, I will stop writing and go back and read and edit everything I've written up to that point. Doing so not only allows me to straighten up any sloppiness that needs straightening, it also helps me get a sense for how the entire story is flowing, and just as important, it reacquaints me with everything I've written before. It's surprisingly easy to forget how the story sounded when you wrote it several months ago. I always enjoy these edits since they both allow me a little break and a chance to just go back and enjoy my story as a reader. The latest post in the video series on my blog is first-person POV versus third-person POV, which is right for your book. It discusses the pros and cons of first-person POV versus third-person POV in order to help you make the right decision for your book. To find the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled Stories That Matter: 5 Necessary Factors for Creating Weighty Fiction. What is weighty fiction? I would argue that it is almost unto itself the definition for stories that matter. It's the opposite of fluffy fiction, which isn't to say there's anything wrong with fluff. We all enjoy a fair share of that as well. Most authors, though, want to write something that matters. Even if we're never going to win the Pulitzer or be canonized alongside Dickens and Dostoevsky, we still want to know the stories we're spinning are more than just stories. We want them to touch people's lives, make them think, make them question, make them believe. The chief ingredient in any story with that capability is always going to be truth in the form of verisimilitude and a strong thematic premise. But there's more. You can create a story seeping with truth and framed upon an excellent premise, and yet it can still fail to be weighty. When a thematically rich story comes up short in the weight department, it just has a feel of flabbiness. It feels as if it failed to take full advantage of its potential. But feelings, however important to a writer, are ultimately a little difficult to quantify. So, let us examine the subject logically in order to identify the 5 most important factors in creating weight and substance in stories that matter. Factor number 1 for stories that matter: subtext. This is the biggie. No subtext equals no depth equals no weight. In one of my video posts, I talked recently about how I realized that the magic ingredient in every single one of my favorite stories was subtext. The sense of the untold in a story, the sense that there is more just beneath the surface. But beyond just that sense, the story also needs to offer solid hints, solid questions that can guide readers to using their own imaginations to fill in some of those blanks. In short, you have to create depth and then take advantage of it. The right way to create subtext. Ridley Scott's Gladiator does a marvelous job of this. The weight of the backstory is evident from the very beginning thanks to the skillful and telling interactions between characters who have known each other all their lives. We sense immediately the baggage present in Maximus's relationships with Marcus Aurelius, Lucilla, and Commodus, as well as amongst the emperor and his children. That subtext is then paid off throughout the story with just enough deft revelations to explain away our most salient questions without condescending to explain everything to us. The wrong way to create subtext. By contrast, Kevin Reynolds' Tristan and Isolde is a story that brims with the potential for subtext in the characters' relationships and motivations. Tristan's ghost, being saved by Lord Mark, who loses his hand in the process and then adopts Tristan, offers potential. But Tristan's true feelings about this incident are never satisfactorily developed. As a result, the conflict at the center of the story, between his love for Isolde and his loyalty to Mark, end up lacking both depth and weight. Factor number 2 for stories that matter, passage of time. Not that you can't tell a powerful story in a very short amount of time, but as a general rule, the more time in which you have to develop the plot, the more significant the character development will seem. Although it's possible for people to be transformed quickly, most evolutions are the process of much time, if only because we need more than one catalyst to prompt the change. Consider how much more weight you gain from sticking a character in prison for a year versus imprisoning him for only a week or two. The right way to utilize passage of time. Gladiator covers a significant amount of time as Maximus journeys from war in Germania to his devastated home in Spain, to slavery in Zuccobar, to the gladiatorial games in Rome. The passage of time is handled artfully so that it never slows the story's pacing, but it creates the understanding within us that the character's sufferings are not the fleeting pains of a moment. Thanks to that alone, what he undergoes seems much more important. The wrong way to utilize passage of time. Aside from the 10 or so years that pass between the prologue and the main story, the passage of time in Tristan and Isolde is never made clear. Tristan's wound seems to heal overnight. The journey from Cornwall in Ireland and back again is performed in a twinkling many times, and we're never given any kind of idea how much time passes after Isolde arrives in England. As a result, the story feels rushed, and the characters' reactions never gain the weight they might otherwise have done. Factor number 3 in stories that matter, multiple settings. Again, it's totally possible to tell a powerful and meaningful story that remains primarily in just one setting. John Sturgis's Great Escape and Yanu Zong's Flower of War are two of my favorite examples. But you can often create a deeper sense of depth and importance by making sure your plot will affect your characters in more than just one place. The right way to use multiple settings. In self-respecting epic fashion, Gladiator manages to traverse almost the entirety of the Roman Empire. Doing so allows us to gain a sense of the world in which Maximus lives, the imperial power he faces, and the scope of the population that will be affected by his actions. It also works hand in hand with the passage of time to evolve the sense that the character has journeyed far, seen much, and endured many things in his pursuit of his goal. Most importantly, the extensive use of settings in this story is never extraneous. They are never present simply for the sake of creating epic scope. They always serve the plot in a sensible and necessary way. The wrong way to use multiple settings. Tristan and Isolde showcases two countries, England and Ireland. But both countries are reduced to two seemingly tiny settings. The lords from all over England frequently gather in Cornwall, as if the country were tiny enough to make their journeys insignificant. The uniting of England is a major theme, but the size of that problem is reduced significantly in our minds simply because we never get a sense of a country rather than a handful of small neighboring villages. Factor number 4 for stories that matter, subplots. Big stories are just that, big. As such, they're about more than just one thing. The character's primary conflict will be supported and contrasted by other concerns, just as our own major problems in real life usually spawn smaller problems. When we reduce a story to a single issue, we eliminate its context and therefore its subtext. Subplots allow us to explore multiple facets of our characters' lives and struggles. Every subplot needs to be pertinent to the main plot, but don't feel that a small amount of divergence for the sake of thematic exploration is something to be avoided. The right way to include subplots. Gladiator is an extremely focused story, but it is still able to offer many layers. The primary conflict is ultimately that of saving Rome, but Maximus's personal journey to vengeance fuels most of the plot. The relationships between Maximus and Lucilla, Maximus and Proximo, Maximo and the other gladiators, Lucilla and Commodus, even Commodus and his nephew Lucius, all work together to weave a tapestry of rich contrast and color that would otherwise have been lost if the story had been reduced to nothing more than a quest for revenge. The wrong way to include subplots. Tristan and Isolde offers the opportunity for exceedingly juicy subplots via the relationships of Tristan with pretty much every character in the story. But none are taken advantage of. All the focus is on his relationship with Isolde. Even his crucial relationship with Lord Mark is sadly undeveloped. In crafting your subplots, remember that even just a single small conversation between characters, exploring their motivations in relation to one another, can transform your story. Factor number 5 for stories that matter: emotional and intellectual sequel scenes. Every scene in your story is made of two halves: scene, action, and sequel, reaction. The action in the scene is what moves the plot. But the reaction in the sequel is where the character development and the thematic depth will almost always be found. Never neglect your sequels. For every important event in your story, you must take the time to demonstrate your characters' reactions, both intellectually and emotionally. If readers don't know how your characters feel about events, they won't be able to properly draw their own conclusions about what to think. The right way to create sequels. Gladiator didn't win awards because it was an action story. It won critical acclaim because it perfectly balanced its action with strong sequel scenes showing the characters' reactions and emotional processes. When Maximus reacts to his identity being revealed at the midpoint, in the scene in which Lucilla visits his cell, he shows his anger, his frustration, his determination, and his sense of betrayal, even in regard to her. Without this scene, and others like it, his emotional process could only be guessed at. The wrong way to create sequels. On a technical level, Tristan and Isolde structures its scenes and sequels properly. But the sequels are almost uniformly disappointing. With few exceptions, the characters, and especially Tristan, never really discuss the intricacies and complexities of their reactions. This is a story that centers around Tristan's conflicted loyalty to a man to whom he owes everything. But that is never touched upon in a satisfactorily direct way. Excellent subtext can only exist when the text itself offers enough meat for readers to chew on. If you can implement just these 5 factors in your story, whatever your theme or subject, you'll be able to bring instant weight to your plot. The result will be a story that is much more likely to matter to your readers than the vast majority of what they read. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.